Hello dear tea friends from around the world, and welcome to a new tea class with me, Stéphane Erler, the founder of the Tea Masters blog, and also the owner of the tea-masters.com boutique, where you find all my wonderful tea wares and a selection of teas. And we already have one tea from this year, 2022. So please check it out if you are interested in tea, which I'm sure you are, because you are here today to listen to a new class, and we are going to talk about pu'er tea. Why pu'er now? I thought, well, spring is coming soon. We have a wonderful weather changing now to blue sky, warmer temperature. Actually, sometimes it already feels like summer during daytime in Taiwan almost. So in Taiwan, there is no real spring. It's either winter or it's summer. But before the spring season starts, still in the early morning or in the evening, it's still a bit cold and it's still winter time. And I guess in your countries, in the US, in Canada, or in France, in Europe, in the UK, it's still even, of course, it's still very cold. It's still officially winter. So it's still a time when we are drinking pu'er, because pu'er is a very warming tea. But when it starts to become too warm, then it's a tea that I don't drink so much, because it makes me sweat a lot. So it's really a great tea with lots of energy for the winter, but a little bit less so for the warmer seasons. So to take a step back, pu'er tea is part of the Heicha, the black tea category. Remember, there are 6 categories of tea, and we look at these categories. They were created in terms of oxidation level. The least oxidized are the green tea, yellow tea, and then the white tea, which is simply dried. Then we have the partially oxidized tea, which is oolong, the oolong category. Then we have the fully oxidized tea, which the Chinese called hongcha. So I translate it into red tea, but very often it's also called black tea in the Western world. And the last tea we are going to talk about is Heicha, so the fermented teas. And in the fermented teas, I want to look more at pu'er tea, which is only one tea in the fermented area. There are other fermented teas in China, made in different provinces, such as Sichuan or Hunan. Pu'er is part of Heicha, but is not equal to all the Heicha. It's not the only fermented tea. And in fermented tea, we have then pu'er, and in pu'er we can still divide it between sheng and shou, between raw and cooked. So today I'm only going to focus on the raw pu'er, because it's the most consumed in among tea aficionado. It's also the one with the most interesting aging potential. It's one that where the leaves will the most transform, because if it's cooked pu'er, it's very stable. It has been fully fermented, and then of course there's not much room for change, even though there is a little bit, but really it's very, very slow. It takes long time. Whereas with Sheng Puerh, with the raw pu'er, this transformation is quite noticeable year after year, and it is one of the most fascinating things that is happening in tea if you are aging tea. It's really also the tea that is the most easy, or maybe not the most easy, but the most suitable for aging, because it has so much power that it can better withstand the changes of time. time is always a weakening of your aroma. You always lose something, so you need a very powerful tea so that it can be aged, and this is really what Sheng Puerh is all about. So in this description, what is Sheng Puerh? So let's go back in history. Sheng Puerh in the Chinese tea world really only appeared in the Ming Dynasty. That's 14th, 15th hundred, and so roughly 500–600 years ago only. Some people say, oh, actually it dates back to Tang Dynasty because, because in Tang, tea was pressed into bricks or cakes. But no, actually there's no relationship between Puerh and Tang Dynasty tea. Tang Dynasty was green tea only, so Puerh only really starts in the Ming Dynasty for the in the Chinese tea culture. Of course, there are Puerh teas that are over 1,000 years old that we still can find in Yunnan, so it's really not to be excluded that the people who are the tribes, Aborigine tribes who are living or who were living in Yunnan at that time in the Tang Dynasty already, that they already were were using these leaves in a way or another, but this was not done in the traditional tea way of that was invented now during Tang Dynasty by not invented by him, but that was recorded by Lu. So the Puerh really only appeared in the Chinese tea culture in the Ming Dynasty. The name Puerh is interesting because it's a town in Yunnan. It's a trading town, so the tea got its name from this town, not because it was a production site, but because it was a trading town where people bought it. So that's where it got its name. Another interesting historical fact about this Puerh is that there are records of such tea being offered to the Beijing palace where the emperor lived, and where he would record or request such gifts. And the National Palace Museum now in Beijing, they found out actually a few years ago that they still have in their collection Jingua Gongcha, golden melon, something like 2.5 kilogram heavy. So a melon, they say it has it looks like almost like a human head, and it was dating to Emperor Guangxu, late 19th century. So it is probably the oldest Puerh where we are sure this is really over 130 years old. Puerh, it's this golden melon, 2.5 kilogram pressed Puerh that is now in the National Palace Museum in Beijing. In terms of history, also we can trace back Puerh. There are different moments in the history of Puerh. Until, of course, until the communists took over China, it was mostly a a private affair. There were private companies which were called Hao, Tongqing Hao, Songping Hao, etc., that were producing puer. And with advent of communist era, everything was nationalized, and there was only one company which has the monopoly for all foods in China, and it also controlled the production of tea, and in Yunnan it controlled the production of puer. So this was between 1949 until the year, roughly the year 2000. That's roughly when it was privatized. And since then, again, everything has been privatized, and there are private companies, lots of different private companies coming in and out of business, competing with each other, and therefore the market is much more difficult to understand. But we'll try to make some sense out of it. One way to make sense out of it is to understand where the customers are, who has the power to decide to buy puer, who is the most interested in puer at a particular time. And until 1990, we can say this was mostly in the Hong Kong area that there was the most puer drinkers. Maybe this had something to do also with their cuisine, which is a very good pairing with puer, especially with Sheng Puerh, and that's why actually the process for Sheng Puerh was more invented in Guangdong than in Yunnan. That's close the bracket. Then, after 1990, the bigger interest happened to be in Taiwan, and especially after 1997, when Hong Kong reversed back to China, the interest in Hong Kong was completely gone, and really most companies transferred a lot of their old puer to Taiwan, because in the 1990s that's where the most interest for puer was. Then gradually China took its rise, and I would say it's in the year 2005 with the airing of a series on the Chama Gudao, the old tea road of puer, how it was exported, how it was sent to Tibet, for instance, by carriage, by horse. That there was this series on Chinese TV which reached a lot of viewers, because it's really the largest TV company in the TV business. There are much less privatization. So this 8 parts series touched a lot of viewers, and then the interest for puer really took off in China. And since their economy also took off around that time, after the accession to the WTO, so they were so since then really the purchasing power for puer is mostly in China, and much less puer gets exported from Yunnan to the rest of the world. All the best leaves remain in China. What else can we say? Yeah, so remember in the year 2000 there was a lot of there was this privatization that created a kind of a Far West, with a lot of confusion in the market, with lots of new players, and the methods, the production methods, everything was in an upheaval, and this caused a lot of not enough clarity, and people were printing previous wrappers to forge the monopoly time CNNP wrappers from older times. So in order to fight this anarchy in the market, in the year 2008, Yunnan decided to really give a very strict definition of what is pu'er. They say the leaves must be daillé, big leaf cultivar. So the leaf cultivar must be big leaves for pu'er. It must be grown in Yunnan. It must be sun-dried, and it has to be transformed in Yunnan. So if your leaves are coming from a different country, they cannot be called pu'er. If you export them, or if you move them to a different province, like Guangdong, there is a famous cake pressed in Guangdong. It also cannot be called pu'er anymore, even though the leaves come from Yunnan. And if you are not using the traditional sun-dry method to dry your leaves, then also you cannot, you should not be able to call your tea pu'er. Pu'er is really mostly harvested in spring, but it can also be harvested in the fall season, and the spring will have the lightest, the finest aromas. The fall harvest is much rougher in terms of taste, and therefore the way that the fall harvest is usually used is that it is not pressed on its own, or it can, of course, everything can happen, but what is really more common is that the fall harvests will be mixed with spring harvests in order to decrease the cost, and maybe if it's well done, it can also add some power to the taste. So this is something that one has to be aware of. Now, in terms of new development in the pu'er world, because what I've said until now is nothing so new, but now what is really newer in more recent years is that the process of pu'er has been a bit changed due to market reasons. Let's say the very powerful firm Dai, which took over from Monghai, one of the big players in the market, they have added a new step in the process called Menhuang, and this step is in Chinese, Menhuang means we make the leaves a bit, stuff them, and so that they become a bit yellow. So actually it means they are oxidizing a bit the leaves during the process, so that this process resembles a bit more the oolong process, this oxidation process, and this has effect that the leaves, such leaves, will have a bit a stronger smell when you smell them when it's just done. So it has the advantage that even though you don't open your cake, you don't try it, already the cake itself and the jian, the 12 tongs pack that you have in front of you will have a nice smell. So maybe it will lead you into thinking that it is a nice tea because it smells nice. But this additional step of making it a little bit more like a oolong will have the other effect that while it smells nice when it's young, it will make the leaves less suitable for aging. So this is a little bit a drawback. It's maybe a positive thing for the company because they can sell them more easily because the tea smells nicer in the beginning. But for the consumer, you have to be aware that these teas should be drunk very quickly because they are not as suitable as previous puers for long-term aging. Another recent development is the interest for Sheng Puerh. Actually, the more the Chinese have understood puer, the more they've appreciated the difference between taidi, which means plantation puer, and gushu puer. Gushu means old arbor puer, so very old trees that have been growing, sometimes planted by man, sometimes a little bit tended by man, but much more freely than plantation trees. So these, I would say, all the interest in puer is in this gushu puer, which is what makes puer completely different from any other tea. All the other teas are all plantation teas, from white, yellow, green, oolong and red. Really all the teas that we are consuming are planted, harvested, managed in plantations. But gushu puer is a little bit really an exception to this rule, is that these trees can be very old and can be growing a bit on their own. They are much more resistant to pests. They have developed a kind of a protection with their buds. Their buds are kind of multiple buds, one leaf protecting another leaf, and this really creates a special quality to puer that traditional taidi plantation puers don't have. So sometimes when we look at the market in the last 15 years, since the interest in China increased thanks to this series on the Chamagu Dao, on the ancient tea road, ancient horse tea road, we noticed that while the price of plantation puer is fluctuating a lot, sometimes up and then down, up and down, the price of gushu puer actually is only going up and is already very, very high and getting higher. It's really becoming the luxury good in China per se, a luxury that you cannot find anywhere else in the world, only in China, and therefore, as a matter of pride, it's even more interesting for these billionaires in China to own these gushu puer. And because there is such an interest now in gushu puer from famous places like Laobanzang, Bijiang, Bingdao, etc., Yiwu, what we are observing is some cloning, so that some farmers are cloning very old gushu puer trees, cutting some branches and replanting them on their own in a different place, and in a couple of years there will be more and more harvests of these new trees made from clones of very famous Sheng Puerh. So this is a new development that we might or might not hear about, because this is really for the designed to please those who are really interested in the top Sheng Puerh, and who are thinking, oh, the production is not large enough. How can we increase the production of Sheng Puerh? Well, this is one of the answers that they are experimenting right now. Of course, the quality won't be as good, but it still will be better than tidy. Well, it's going to be interesting to observe how it's going. So, thank you very much for your interest, and I think that I will leave it at this for today. I'm going to brew this Sheng Puerh maybe next time live during the show, so that you can also see how Puerh is brewed. And if you are live, I'm going to brew it now and answer your questions live on my show. Thank you very much. For the others, please give me a thumbs up if you have enjoyed this show, and see you next week for another tea class. Bye bye.